the 15 years since I've been retired? Well, the answer is because it's such a fascinating topic. And I think of it somewhat like French grammar. There's lots and lots of rules, but lots and lots of exceptions, and then exceptions to the exceptions. So it's intellectually quite challenging. Also, it involves people. Most fields of law involve property and money, but this involves people in their lives. So it's really an interesting topic. Why is it such a hot topic? Well, we all know why, because it's been the subject of the political campaigns in the last few campaigns. There are stories in the paper every day that relate to immigration, and some days there's multiple stories. Regarding to solving, there's no solution. It's a conundrum, and it's always going to be a subject that can't really be fully solved. Now, talking about the many stories in the newspaper, just to mention a few, and the handout is primarily newspaper stories that I've noticed in the past few days, weeks, and some of them go back to the spring. But stories this year, current stories relate to the Build Back Better bill. One of the unsolved or unworked out issues has to do with immigration. So I understand that the framework does have an immigration component. And in order to make it fit within the reconciliation concept needs of the Senate, they have put in some language about raising fees. So hopefully that will help it pass muster in the Senate, which is a question. We've seen stories about negotiations to settle a lawsuit filed by the ACLU on behalf of separated families. Now that's become a big issue because according to the news reports, negotiations included discussion of paying these families up to $1 million. And families of veterans complained, or not veterans, people who died in service complained, but that's more than we pay the families of service members who died in combat. There is criticism of the immigration court's dedicated dockets. Now, the immigration courts are very dear to my heart, and I have a passion for trying to get them restructured so that the courts are independent of the Justice Department. Then we saw, a few weeks ago, we saw a lot of stories about families and unaccompanied children from Central America arriving in increasing numbers. More recently, there has been evacuation of Afghans, thousands of whom are now in the United States. And then that was followed with stories about Haitians massing at the border. That seems to have departed from the headlines, but these are stories that have caught our attention, all relating to immigration just in the past few weeks, or even up till today. You'll see in the handout, I've got a story or two from yesterday even. All right, so what creates the tensions here? There are competing objectives. That's what makes it so hard to come up with what one would call a solution. Everybody wants humane treatment for everybody, or maybe almost everybody wants that. But at the same time, we want there to be an orderly process. We don't want people engaging in dangerous journeys. We want them to have regular channels they can use to.
I can't hear Joan Churchill.
Somebody said they can't hear me, but I can hear myself. I don't know. Is there a problem?
If you're having difficulty hearing, you might need to adjust the volume on your computer. Just check that you have your volume on.
Okay, well, I'll get closer to my microphone. Does that help?
You're okay, Joan. You're okay.
I'm closer now. Yes, okay.
Joan, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay, good. All right. So one concern is there's got to be a good way for people to come that does not involve engaging in dangerous journeys and does not involve paying smugglers or getting involved with smugglers to come to the United States. At the same time, we have to make sure that everybody who comes here is vetted to make sure they're not a danger to our country. We don't want people who are terrorists to be able to come or criminals. And we are a nation of laws, so we expect people to come within the law. What happens is that not everybody qualifies to come within the law, so they're tempted to use irregular routes, such as smugglers and engage in dangerous journeys. Now, our law provides for lots of categories. This is what makes it all so challenging. And I'm going to cover some of those categories in a few minutes. And then there are lots of exceptions to the categories. And a major one is that people who are here, no matter their status, can apply for asylum. So I'm going to mention now an overview of what I'm going to cover today. I'll discuss first the reversal of policies of the prior administration, Afghan evacuees, Haitian migrants massing at the border, Central American families, and then legislative initiatives that would include also some White House executive actions. So now I start with the substance of my remarks, starting with a comparison with the policies of the prior administration. Major, and I won't mention all of them, there are so many. There were so many changes that the Trump administration instituted. I've seen an estimate there were about 200 changes that his administration made. But major ones that we notice are immediately there was a freeze on funding for the border wall. There was an announcement that the migrant protection program, it's so called, but better terminology is the Stay in Mexico program for people arriving at the border, that was ended, but a court has reinstated it. The current government has said that it will reinstate it, but it requires an agreement with the Mexican government, so it isn't clear exactly what's going to happen with that. Agreements with third countries to take migrants who had transited through their countries en route to the United States have been canceled. And those were actually the countries in Central America that are the source of many of the migrants coming to the US recently: El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. The Biden administration reinstated priorities for removal proceedings, whereas previously the attitude had been anybody who comes to the attention of the government who doesn't have lawful status should be put in removal proceedings. So there's now priorities. And for the immigration court, some repressive policies by the prior administration limiting the discretion of the immigration judges have been reversed. These include mandatory quotas and various docket tools such as administrative closure, continuances, termination. And also the prior administration, under the prior administration, the Attorney General issued a number of decisions reversing what had been years of precedents. Those Attorney General decisions have now been reversed, gone back to the prior understanding of the law. And another major one is that the president, right after coming into office, increased the refugee quota. Now, this was where he really had a major stumble at the beginning of his administration. The president has the authority to set an annual quota for refugees. It's actually a maximum number that can come. When Obama left office, he had they leave office near the end of at the beginning of a new year, but at the end of the year, just after the election, Obama increased the refugee quota quite a bit. But then when Trump came in, he immediately reduced it. And over the 4 years, he reduced it each year considerably. So I think when at the end of the Obama administration, the annual quota was 75,000. When Trump left office, he had reduced it to 15,000. And actually only about 2,000 or 3,000 had come in during the year. There's just such stringent requirements have been imposed. You all may remember that we had set up a program to adopt, our congregation had a program to adopt a refugee family that the congregation started working on about 3 years ago. But then there was no refugee assigned for us to have as the adopted family for quite a long time. Now, a policy that has not changed by this administration, at least not yet, is the use of Title 42, which is a public health authority, allowing expelling people who arrive at the border without giving them a chance to apply for asylum. And those people are being just told they can't come in. It's questionable whether that violates our treaty obligations. As I mentioned before, asylum is supposed to be available to anyone who arrives here, whatever their status. When I say asylum available, an application for asylum. There's no guarantee of a grant of asylum. The asylum and refugee definition have rather specific requirements that have been the subject of a lot of litigation. To be characterized as a refugee, to be granted refugee status, which one applies for outside the United States, or asylum, which one applies for inside the United States. It's the same definition. They have to establish a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, and political opinion. There've been that wording comes from a UN document adopted shortly after World War II, and the United States signed on to it more recently, and then passed a law that uses the very same terminology, the Refugee Act of 1980. But the wording is deliberately vague, and there've been a lot of cases over the years about exactly what is covered by that language. So I'm going to transition now to discuss the Afghan evacuees, because we tend to call them refugees, but when we call them that, we're using the term refugee in a common sense of people who fled where they came from for some reason. But as I mentioned, the US law has a specific definition of refugee, and it has to be a person who has either suffered persecution or has a well-founded fear of persecution in the future on account of one of 5 reasons. Now, the people coming who were evacuated from Afghanistan actually are members of lots of different categories. They're not all refugees. So some of the people that were evacuated were US citizens. Some of them were lawful permanent residents. So these were citizens or permanent residents who happened to be in Afghanistan at the time that the Taliban took over and the evacuation took place. Then some of the people have visas. Now they may have refugee visas, they may have refugee visas that were granted to them somewhere else. They wouldn't have had refugee visas from Afghanistan. Let me come back to that in a moment. They could be people who had already been granted immigrant visas, and there's a lot of categories of immigrant visas, and that includes, a lot of you are probably familiar, an immediate relative, such as if you're married to a a foreigner who's married to a US citizen qualifies usually for an immediate relative visa. And there's a number of other immediate relative categories. And then the category we heard about so much in the news is the special immigrant visa. Now that is a type of immigrant visa, just like an immediate relative. And some of the people who were evacuated had already been granted the special immigrant visa. But there's a lot of complaints over the last few months, right before the evacuation, that process was very slow. Congress, there's a number of different categories for special immigrant visas. It doesn't just include people from Afghanistan. The categories include ministers, people, children who've been abandoned. But one of the types of special immigrant visas that was authorized by Congress in an amendment a few years ago, actually several years ago, was the special immigrant visa for Afghans who had been of assistance to the US military during our military operations in Afghanistan. So people have been coming in that category over several years. Some people who decided they wanted to evacuate from Afghanistan hadn't applied for it, but qualified. So we saw some stories about people. I remember seeing on the news reporter who was still in Afghanistan was asking person in the crowd, you know, when did you apply for the special immigrant visa? And the person said 2 days ago. So anyway, at that point, the US embassy had shut down for business and wasn't able to consider any of the visas. But the people that were evacuated were all taken to our bases or places in other countries. No one was brought here directly. And so some of them were able to complete their visa applications in embassies, or State Department personnel got sent to these locations all over the world where the evacuees were taken. So State Department has been working on the visas for those people while they're still overseas. And then there are other types of visas. I don't know that anyone in the evacuation group had them, but one example would be student visas. If someone already had been granted a student visa, hadn't come yet, or journalists are a type of non-immigrant visa. So there's a number of those. All right. So then there's people that were evacuated who were applicants for visas at the time that the evacuation happened, but they hadn't yet been granted the visa. So those are people, as I mentioned, that the State Department is processing in overseas locations. And during the course of the evacuation or just afterwards, the State Department came up with reevaluation of some of its criteria for refugee visas. And so some of the people that wouldn't have previously been considered eligible for refugee visa are now being considered part of one of the 4 preferences. So there's 4 preferences for refugee visas. So for people who don't qualify for a visa, a lot of people who are evacuated are being allowed to come to the United States on what's called humanitarian parole. Now, the President of the United States has the authority to allow people in who don't have documents, who don't have a visa, who haven't been authorized to come to the United States. The president's allowed to let people in, and it's called parole, without any status. So people, they're not sneaking in, they're allowed to come with sort of the discretion of the president. And there's a rather elaborate process that's been set up for that. And suddenly there's this huge number of people all at once. And I understand the processing is frustratingly slow on that. But again, it's important that people be vetted. So people are being considered for humanitarian parole. And that's an ongoing process. And this is something that even people still in Afghanistan are being considered for, because the Taliban said if a person wants to leave and has some sort of documentation that they'll be allowed elsewhere, they're being allowed to leave. So there's a whole movement right now for the people who did not make it onto the evacuation flights to be able to be certified that they will be able to receive humanitarian parole, and that's helping them leave Afghanistan. Again, the people are not coming directly here. They're being sent to locations around the world where our State Department and other agencies are vetting them. And then sort of included in all these different categories are family members of the people who qualify, such as spouses and children. And some people are bringing other relatives too, like their brothers and sisters and grandmothers. All right, so there's political fallout from the whole business about the Afghan evacuation. We all saw the horrifying video photographs of people hanging on to a plane as it was taking off. So that, and then there was another photo that was very moving, not as horrifying. One of the first flights out, there were 800 people sitting on the floor of a transport plane. So those are both photos, and optics have a lot of effect on the political reaction to immigration issues. So in regard to the Afghan evacuation, we've heard political complaints that a lot of deserving people who helped our military were left behind. And there was inconsistent processing at the airport, so there wasn't a really consistent system for the soldiers who had to decide whether a person was allowed into the Kabul airport or not. And then there's a vetting issue. The Republicans are now claiming that a lot of people are being let in without being vetted, and the terrorists are coming in. I think Trump was quoted as saying that the other day. And that, so while they were first complaining that deserving people were left behind, and now they're complaining that undeserving people, terrorists, are being allowed in without being vetted. But in fact, the vetting is quite substantial. Nobody's being allowed in without being vetted at one of the locations overseas where people are being processed before they're allowed to come to the US. All right, next I'm talking about Haitian migrants massing at the border. So that captured our attention a couple of weeks after the evacuation from Afghanistan. So just a little bit of background about events in Haiti. Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and it's been having problems forever. So many years ago, a status was accorded to Haitians called temporary protected status. Now that's a status that's different than refugee status. That's something that is meant to cover situations that don't qualify for refugee status because they don't involve a fear of persecution. But that may have to do with political upheaval in the country, or war, or natural disasters. So Haiti and other countries in the Caribbean often suffer from hurricanes, volcanoes, floods, things like that. So temporary protected status has been was created some years ago. It doesn't give a permanent resident status, but it's meant to be temporary. However, it tends to be renewed for very long periods of time. President Trump decided that since it was supposed to be temporary, it should be canceled for almost all the categories of people that were in the US with temporary protected status. That's been reversed for the most part by the Biden administration. So just this year in May, temporary protected status was expanded for Haitians. Then in July, the Haitian president was assassinated, And then in August, there was a devastating earthquake. Now, over the course of the period since Biden took office, from January to July, there was a sharp reduction in the number of Haitians who were being expelled at the border under Title 42 that we talked about before, this health measure that allows, refusing to allow people even to come in to apply for asylum. So it went from 55% of the Haitians that appeared at the border in January were what we call expelled. In other words, not allowed, they were just pushed back into Mexico. And that went to 8% in July. So from 55% in January of Haitians being expelled to 8% in July. That's a dramatic change. Now, I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming that the smuggling operations, organizations that operate in the Western Hemisphere, particularly with Mexico, then started advertising that Haitians will be allowed to stay in the United States if they come. So suddenly, this huge number of people all arrived at the same time, all arrived from Haiti, Haitian citizens. They were mostly coming from the countries of Chile, some from Brazil, and maybe a couple other countries in South America where they'd been living for many years. But they all were under the impression that if they came, that they would be allowed into the United States. And they all came to the same spot that seems to be from the pictures, and we've seen the pictures of them crossing what looks like wading a ford. So it's quite a low point. Maybe it's near a dam or something, because the water of people crossing didn't seem to be above their knees. But anyway, they waded over to the US side and camped under a bridge. So this created a lot of media attention. According to the stories, 30,000 of them were apprehended in a 2-week period. And so what happened with that, the camp was cleared out within a couple weeks or so. But of that 30,000, 8,500 were expelled. The government considers that they voluntarily returned to Mexico. Some of them were walking back and forth between the camp under the bridge on the US side and across the river. They were wading back and forth to Mexico because there were shops over there in Mexico. So they were going to buy food and diapers and things. And so the horrific picture we saw there of Border Patrol riding horses in the water looked like they were rounding these people up. And one of them, the most horrific picture, the agent seemed to be grabbing a young teenager. So these pictures, these optics affect the political reactions in our country. But just to give you the statistics on what happened with them, 8,500 went back to Mexico. 2,000 were flown to Haiti, with their country of citizenship, and 12,000 were allowed to apply for asylum. So we don't usually hear about that number, but some of them were allowed in to apply for asylum. So as a result of these flights back to Haiti, about half of the people crossed back into Mexico. A lot fewer came in October. So as I mentioned, 30,000 came in September, 1,000 came in October. And there's a statistic that 26,000 Haitians have requested asylum in Mexico so far this calendar year, which is up from 6,000 in 2020 and 2019. So that's quite a big increase of people applying for asylum from Haiti and Mexico. Well, the political fallout about this, the Republicans complain that Biden has opened the border and that proves it. And we have the optic of the border patrolman rounding people up, which has horrified many people who then are complaining why are the Haitians being treated less generously than the Afghans? It must be for racial reasons because they are Black. So that's the kind of political argument you're hearing from the two sides on that. Turning to the Central American families and unaccompanied children, that's been an ongoing issue for many years. So Title 42 has been continued in force to expel the people, require that those seeking asylum remain in Mexico. But unaccompanied children have been allowed in. So a lot of these Central Americans have been camping on the Mexican side of the US border for a long time, actually, maybe a couple years even. And they've been waiting for their immigration court hearings because that was the Trump policy, that they had to wait there. So they were registered to have a hearing, but they had to wait in Mexico in horrendous conditions. So after the Biden administration started allowing unaccompanied children to stay here, a lot of the families on the Mexican side were sending their children alone across the border. So some of these unaccompanied children were children who've been there for quite a while. And I think it's been uneven. I don't know exactly what the criteria are, but in some cases, families have been allowed in to pursue their asylum application from within the US. Now, we all know about the terrible separation of children at the border under the prior administration a few years ago. And what made it even more horrendous was that there was no record keeping done of which children belonged with which adults. So once the children were separated, it was very hard for the government to find out or figure out who their parents were. And a lot of the parents were deported without the children. The parents had been promised that if they agreed to be deported, that their children would be reunited with them, but that didn't happen. So a lot of these children were effectively orphaned within the United States. The policy was stopped by a judge who said that it had to be ended. So it was officially ended, but it's unclear quite how many children remained separated from their parents. And the ACLU took on the task of trying to find the parents because the government wasn't doing it then. Now that's another change Biden made. He set up a task force to find those families. So what made the news recently was that the ACLU has brought a lawsuit on behalf of the families seeking monetary damages and also agreement that the families can stay in the US. So some of the families who have been located, who were deported, have been brought to the US to reunite with their children. So negotiations are going on. It's not that there's been any agreement to pay any particular sum in monetary damages, but because the amount was so much that's being discussed, and because of the comparison with settlements for military, members of the military not being compensated as much as people who had come without authorization, you can see there's a big political issue there. The president immediately said such a statement was hogwash or something like that. So the negotiations are ongoing, and it doesn't seem to be in the paper this week, but we don't know what the ultimate settlements will be for those families. It involves a couple thousand families at least. Then there've been the other terrible optics. Going back to the prior administration, there was a picture of the bodies of a father and toddler daughter who drowned in the Rio Grande. I mean, that is just such a sad picture when you look at it. The body of the 2-year-old has her arm over the body of her father on the edge of the river. We saw pictures of migrants that appeared to be in cages made up by chain link fences. Then there were tent camps, and it appeared that there was a lot of talk that the borders were open, and the treatment was inhumane in violation of treaty obligations. Part of which, again, there's an argument that anyone who comes to the United States is allowed to apply for asylum upon arrival at the border. That doesn't apply really to people who sneak in, but anybody who has snuck in is in the US and is entitled to apply for asylum. But the statute does say that people who are just arriving at a port of entry can request asylum, but they have to wait elsewhere. Now I'm going to turn now to the congressional actions that are ongoing. All right, there's a lot of, well, I won't say there's a lot of, there's a push for a law to be passed that would be entitled the Afghan Adjustment Act, patterned somewhat on the Cuban Adjustment Act. So under the law, the Cuban Adjustment Act, which was passed many years ago, entitled Cubans who touched foot on US soil to be able to apply to stay in the United States. So that became a category for permanent residents, just the fact that they were Cubans. So so a bill has been drafted. I don't think it's been introduced yet, but a bill has been drafted by a group called Human Rights First to allow that, and it's been taken up by HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. So this is something that there's lobbying going on about right now. Something that did pass is funding for the Afghan evacuees that are in the US to be similar to the type of funding that is given to refugees. So under the Immigration Act, refugees are entitled to a certain amount of funding for a period of time. People who are here as parolees or who come with special immigrant visas aren't entitled to that under our Immigration Act. But the recent continuing resolution did include money to provide for pretty much all the evacuees to get some financial assistance to help them resettle here and adjust. Now, the House of Representatives this Congress has again passed what was known as the Dreamers Act. So this would cover people brought to the United States as children a long time ago, to give them a path to become permanent residents, just on that basis. It's often called a path to citizenship, but to become a citizen, you first have to become a permanent resident and be a permanent resident for a number of years. Well, as you know, that hasn't ever passed the Senate. Now, the Senate actually passed a bipartisan bill in 2013 that would have provided lawful status to a large percentage of almost everybody who'd been in the United States without authorization for a certain number of years. It was part of a comprehensive reform immigration act. It passed the Senate something like 68 to 32. But at the time, the House Majority Leader was Boehner. He refused to even take it up. So that bill was never considered by the House of Representatives. Since then, and since the Democrats have had control of the House, the Dreamer Act has passed each Congress. but it hasn't ever gone to the Senate. The Build Back Better Act is intended to have a provision in it that would provide lawful status for the same group of people that were covered by the Senate bill in 2013. Interestingly, the number of people that are estimated that would be covered by that hasn't changed since 2013. So they used to say it would cover about 12 million non-citizens in the US without authorization. And they currently say it would cover about 11 million. So the actual number has gone down. So that means we're not getting an increase in the number of people in the US without authorization over time. So I find that kind of an interesting factor. Anyway, so that was part of Biden's platform that he ran on, that these people would be legalized. But politically, there's a lot of difficulty about acceptance of that idea. So there's different ideas that have been advanced for what should be done. And I don't think there's been any decision yet about what would actually be covered in the immigration bill. Not the immigration bill, the Build Back Better bill that would cover this topic. But there's at least 3 different ideas that have been floated. And one is, what I think would be the most sensible, is to advance what's called the registry date. The Immigration Act, when it was passed years ago, at least in 1952, when it was originally passed, contained a provision in it that I would call a sort of a forgiveness provision that creates a basis for permanent residence for anybody who's been in the US, or any non-citizen who's been in the US as of a certain date that is not a permanent resident and who would like to be. So that becomes a basis for permanent residence. So the original date was something like 1926 or something like that. And over the course of the years, the date has been advanced as the date, no longer covers anybody. So the date was last advanced in the 1986 legislation. That was the legislation that allowed an amnesty for people in the US illegally, but it also advanced the date. So the current date is January 1, 1972. So anyone who's been in the US since January 1, 1972, under any status, is entitled to apply for permanent residence under that category. Well, there's hardly anybody at the moment who hasn't already obtained the status. And that's now what? That's about close to 50 years ago, right? Previously, the date was advanced like about every 20 years or so. There'd be an advance in the date. So I think that should be the least controversial way to deal with most of these 12 million or 11 million or whatever number of people are here, because I've seen statistics that about 70% of them have been in the US over 10 years at this point. Usually the date is a date like 10 years earlier than when the statute is passed. So that wouldn't be an amnesty, although it would be in effect, but that would give people who've been here and become part of our society an opportunity to regularize their status without it being an amnesty. I've heard that moderates are worried about voting for that, moderate Democrats, and they've countered with a suggestion that instead that the statute should authorize those people parole status for 5 years. So that's sort of a kicking the can down the road idea. As I mentioned, the Dreamer Act has been passed by the House. So the question is whether at least the Dreamers could be covered by this bill when it goes to the Senate. Now that actually is amnesty type provisions. It creates a 2-step status that they would, now remember, these are all young people who came to the United States over 10 years ago at this point. And so they're kind of in their 20s and 30s now for the most part. So the DREAMER Act would create a conditional permanent residence for a couple years, and then they could apply for permanent residence after that. So they still would be many years away from being eligible for naturalization to become citizens. Okay, another piece of legislation very dear to my heart is a draft bill that's been written but not introduced to set up a special immigration court outside the Justice Department so that it would be independent of political influence. And then there's been a number of steps taken in the last month or so to give special treatment to the Afghan evacuees. So I've told you there's a movement to create an Afghan Adjustment Act. I don't believe it's been actually introduced so far. I told you about the continuing resolution, which has been passed to allocate funds for their financial support. And then the White House has issued a waiver of all fees. So this was just authorized a few days ago, so that all types of applications that normally would have a fee are waived for Afghans. And then Senator Blumenthal has introduced an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act. And I was looking that up last night. Apparently there have been hundreds of amendments to the bill because the National Defense Authorization Act always passes. When I say there've been hundreds of amendments, I mean hundreds of amendments submitted. They haven't actually been adopted yet as part of the act. But his bill would require priority attention on assisting with continued evacuation efforts for Afghans of interest who are still in Afghanistan, because there's apparently quite a lot of Afghans still in Afghanistan who were of help to the US military that have not been able to get out. So coming to my conclusions, migration is a constant. There's been migration that we've read about in the Bibles from biblical times. Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden. Abraham left the land of his father. Joseph went to Egypt after being, attempted, the brothers tried to kill him. I think he was sold into slavery. Jacob, Joseph's father, came to Egypt with the family because of a famine, and Moses and our people fled Egypt. And I was just looking at the reasons for these different migrations. Adam and Eve were expelled. They were basically deported for bad behavior. Abraham was seeking adventure when he left his father. Joseph was persecuted by his brothers. In Jacob's case, he migrated to Egypt because there was an environmental problem causing a famine where he was living. And Moses and our people were fleeing slavery when they left Egypt. So in more modern times, we can remember the Jews who were in Brazil, who were expelled from Brazil when the Portuguese retook Brazil. In the 19th century, my ancestors fled Europe because of pogroms, anti-Semitism, military service, and because they were seeking a better life. And then in the Holocaust, they were fleeing genocide, the ones who left. So immigration is going to remain a hot political issue, I think probably forever. My advice or my thought of the best attitude on this is that it's important to maintain acceptance for migration. There's no stopping it. It's always going to happen. I mean, we even talk about how the Indians were the natives here originally who got displaced, but even they migrated here from Asia. So migration, as I say, it's a constant. I think it's important to maintain compassion for those who migrate and to promote systems that facilitate legal avenues for people to migrate so that people can live openly and contribute to their societies where they live. You know, studies show that our country, it's a big country, and that more immigration would actually be a big benefit to our economy. And then we have the tensions arise about cultural issues and the fact that accepting other people means adjusting to their cultures, or they tend to change our culture. So that's my closing note. Thank you.
So it's all biblical, huh, Joan? Can you hear me? Am I muted?
I'm not muted, no.
It's all biblical, right?
Oh, okay. Well, it goes back to biblical times for sure.
Yeah.
Even before biblical times, I think.
Well, we had a couple questions, actually. One asked for an explanation about what vetting means, who does the vetting, and can it really be done on thousands of people whose backgrounds are difficult to trace? What's a little explanation about how it gets
Well, it
done?
sounds like Frank knows what vetting is. It means checking out people's backgrounds,
Yeah.
subjecting to criminal background checks. And so I don't know all the methods they use overseas, but our military, our CIA and so forth have a way of checking people's backgrounds to determine if they have a criminal background or terrorists. And that's basically what people are being vetted for. And they've actually come up with a number of people that have been evacuated that the phrase being used is that there's red flags on those people. And one of the articles in my handout discusses the fact that these people are now in limbo because they're not being admitted to the United States, and it's not clear where they can go or where they can be accepted. So that's become an issue. And I don't have the exact number on them, but there's a number, some hundred, I think, of people that who've been refused admission, who were evacuated, refused admission to the US, who were evacuated by our folks from Afghanistan.
We have one hand up from the audience. Mildred, you want to
Hi,
unmute
Joan.
yourself?
Yes, Joan, thank you for your well-prepared presentation. I was at the Bethesda Hyatt in early October, and after several days of seeing people on every floor with walkie-talkies and badges around their neck, I finally asked what was going on, and they told me they were monitoring the refugees from Afghanistan. And I just found that really interesting that they were at the Hyatt and they were just kind of milling about. And I was wondering if they had been
That's
vaccinated.
them. They're calling you, Mildred.
I know it. I'm trying to mute it. I was trying to decide if I was wondering if they were, keeping them under house arrest, so to speak, if they were going to vaccinate them and what they were going to do with those people. Thank you.
Are you saying the evacuees were at the Hyatt too?
At the Hyatt in Bethesda. And I asked at the front desk who was paying for it, and they said, I was.
Oh.
They said the State Department, but I found it really interesting. I didn't know. I saw people milling about the lobby, and I first thought it was a convention.
Okay.
Interesting.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So it's right in our backyard, and Mildred's paying for it, which I thought is very generous. Very generous. If I can ask Joan, for a number of years, it seemed very difficult to get things through the courts, the immigration courts. Have they changed, expanded, added more judges, brought back people? Are you working again?
No, they haven't asked me to come back, although I've expressed willingness. The sort of all of the above. With the change in priorities, a lot of the cases are going to be able to come off the docket. The last number is 1.4 million cases in the backlog of the immigration courts. So Biden's attitude, and this was in his in the platform, was to expand the number of immigration judges dramatically. So when I started, just to give you some perspective, it was 1980, and with my day on the job, my first day on the job, I was the 30th in seniority. That means there were 30 of us on the bench in 1980. There's currently about 500, and the numbers I think could reach 700. You know, I was the only judge in Washington, D.C. initially, and currently I think there's about 20 some. So there's more judges. Now, one concern a lot of us have who are concerned about the independence of the court and so far is that the system was so polluted under the prior administration that we were very concerned that just adding more judges was gonna, into a polluted situation wasn't gonna help. There needed to be reform of the system before adding more judges would help, but that would require an act of Congress, so that's certainly a long way off.
Right. There are a couple of more questions here about any action by the U.S. is from Ellen to alleviate the conditions in Latin America, Central America, to lessen the reasons for people to leave. And I think you talked about an increase in aid to those parts of the world to try to improve the situation, the economy and whatnot there.
I didn't actually mention that, but that was the portfolio given to Vice President Harris to work on that. That had been the portfolio given to Biden when he was vice president. What I did hear is that it didn't work under Obama. And the one problem is that those governments are notoriously corrupt, and it isn't clear that any assistance for that type of effort would actually achieve its objectives.
Yeah, we haven't figured it out yet.
That's just part of it. I'm sure there's lots of other problems too. But I think there is some effort being made to interview people in country to see if they would qualify for refugee visas. And
but it sounds like we've just not come up with a method to improve the situation there. They stay there. They're still coming. They're still coming. Another question that came in was how many Afghans have actually been admitted to the U.S.? Do you know that by any chance?
Yeah, I do have the figure. I think I don't have it in front of me, but I think it's around 80,000. And when you say admitted, that's a technical legal term. So the ones who've been paroled here have not been admitted, but they're physically here.
Yeah.
And
I think that's what the
here
question
with permission. Yeah.
I think that's what the gist of it was, here with permission. And about 80,000, you say. There's another one here
I
about.
just want to mention in passing, because you had us read a book with the book group.
Right.
Called American Dirt, which covered the story of a mother and child fleeing Acapulco, Mexico, which seemed at the time I read the book like a rather unlikely place. This was a novel, but the author claimed this was based on interviews she'd had with lots of people. And I think she accompanied some of these groups, but it covered the story of people coming to the United States using very dangerous methods, sneaking in, not getting caught, using smugglers, and then ending up in Gaithersburg.
Where else?
So I know it's a fascinating story, and it details the different types of, it was sort of like the Odyssey, all the different types of issues and events that could happen on the route. Yeah.
Very powerful, very powerful. So here's another one about what about people coming into the country on tourist visas and overstaying? Are there a lot of them? What happens to them? Are we catching them and throwing them out, or what?
In the
Is that really a
past,
big problem?
well, there's certainly a lot of unauthorized people in the US who have overstayed rather
Yeah.
than snuck in at the border. We don't hear talk about them as much.
Mhm.
And they would have trouble getting jobs and so forth because they wouldn't have work authorization
Mhm.
documentation.
Mhm.
I think for a period, there were a lot of Irish in that category. And while Senator Kennedy was still alive, he actually is behind the major amendment to the act in 1965, which changed the way quotas are allocated so that it wouldn't favor the British and the Germans as much as it used to. But as a result, the Irish weren't able to come as easily as they used to. So he was behind what the law that created what's called the diversity visa, which gave chances to people to get it, to qualify for immigrant visas who didn't qualify under other types of statuses.
Mhm.
But as to how much of a problem it is, I mean, I don't have any handle on that, but it is a basis for being here unauthorized. So some of the 12 million are in that category. I actually met one at the temple once. I don't know if he's on the call tonight.
Well, let's see, what else do we have here? Thank yous, a lot of thank yous. One thing I want to mention that we hadn't discussed is the Pew organization has put out has any number of studies on immigration. And just recently they did one that sliced the political spectrum based on Republican versus Democrat and where within those groups people fit. And it's a real stripe collection. So if you're interested, there are some very interesting studies. They're a pretty serious group. And they specifically deal with the issue of immigration. I hate to end on a down note, but it strikes me, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, that if we came back here 2-3 years from now, maybe you change the date at the top of your notes, maybe you'd scratch a couple of things out, but it sounds like we are, as you said, it's biblical, it goes back a long ways. We're going to see a lot of the same problems not really get resolved, and maybe a few of them. And the fundamentals probably stay fairly similar. Is that you feel sort of the same way, or do you feel a little different, a little more optimistic?
Well, I wouldn't consider that a down note. I think, as I said, migration is going to continue forever. We've had it forever. It's going to continue forever. There was one question that came in advance about why haven't any of the administrations legalized these large number of people that are here without authorization that don't have status, even though they've been here for 10, 15 years. And the answer is political. There just isn't the political will to get it done, even though there've been, you know, Republican control at times, Democratic control at times. And currently we're seeing even the divide because supposedly the moderate Democrats are so afraid that if they vote even to legalize those people, or maybe even the dreamers, that they will be voted out of office at the next election.
Yeah, it's a lot of complicated issues, yes.
I wanted to answer my cousin Laura, who asked, how can anyone know how many unauthorized individuals are in the US? The answer is one can't. So it's based on statistics. When people come up with these figures that it's 11 million or whatever, it's all speculation, but it's based on scientific ways of speculating. I think people at the Census Bureau engage in that. And you know, there was a whole big controversy a year or so ago, and I think it brought the government to a shutdown for a period.
Was that the question in the census you're referring to?
Yeah, it had to do with whether there should be a question in the census about a person's immigration status, which would have come up with some harder figures on that. But
well, Joan, thank you really an awful lot. I can't tell you how appreciative we are. And I want to thank all your cousins and relatives out on in the chat room here who are throwing all these questions at you. They're more than welcome. And if anybody has any further questions and wants to send them over, just respond to the last reminder you got, and I'll shoot them over to Joan. You know, this program, Inside the Issues, was designed to build on the capabilities and expertise of congregants. So if anybody has any ideas or people they know or things they'd like to hear about, let us know. We'll see if we can put together a program. Each one of these is unique. Each one of these deals with it in ways you will probably never see on TV. And frankly, on the Zoom, you're up close and personal with the speaker. It has some advantages. One last thing, the Empty Nesters have a...
Can I just add one more thing I meant to cover?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. And that is the situation in Belarus. What
Yes.
a creative action the president of Belarus has taken to use migrants basically as weapons. And, you know, when we talk about migration, you talk about, will anything be different in 2 years? Who would have ever imagined anything like that? This is not smugglers. This is the president of Belarus inviting all these people to come to Belarus on packages with, you know, air flight. They pay for their flight, the hotel, and then sending them to the border with Poland, which is heavily fortified, and then putting barbed wire behind them. So they're stuck. They can't go back to Belarus. They can't go into Poland. The situation is just awful.
So we wait for some positive, optimistic situation, and there you go. Not very positive, not very positive. So once again, thank you very much. The Empty Nesters have another event coming up on December 10th with Kristen Harmel and a new book, Forest of Vanishing Stars. She's been with us before. She's an excellent speaker. The book is very good. I would heartily recommend it to you. And if you are not on our list and want to be on our list, actually, even if you don't want to be on our list, if you're here tonight, you're on our list, and we will let you know about what's going on. So with that, once again, I want to thank Joan and the rabbi, if she's still with us tonight.
I'm still here. I'm still here.
Very good, very good.
Happy to be able to help.
Right. I mean, we have the smartest, most qualified tech support people.
Well, I also wanted to, well, I was here because we have the smartest in, you know, our own immigration judge, and being able to learn from Joan on an issue that remains relevant. And it's wonderful to have you guide us and teach us, and on such an important issue. Well, thanks again, and good night to everybody. Thank you, Rabbi. And we'll see you at the next event.